About to begin a study of the Ten Commandments throughout the fall. It's where we are in the book of Exodus. And we have made a little bit of the holiness of God over the last couple of weeks as a sort of run-up to the Ten Commandments. Because what are the Ten Commandments but a reflection, propositionally, of the holy character of God Himself? And so the law of God and the moral law is as relevant to our lives today as is God's character is relevant. When people say we're not under law, we're under grace, for instance, quoting Romans 6:14, for sin will not have mastery over you because you're not under law, you're under grace. That is not a dismissing of the law of God as the standard for morality, as the standard for knowing that which pleases Him. What Paul is getting at in Romans 6:14 when he says we will not have sin take dominion over us because we're not under law, we're under grace, is that the law of God does not have what it takes to keep us from sinning. The law of God exposes our sin. Grace, however, does have what it takes to prevent us from sinning. That's what Paul is getting at there. But the law of God is as relevant as is the character of God is, because the law of God is a reflection of the character of God. And so we're going to take time over the next few weeks to study the Ten Commandments. We'll look at them biblically, exegetically. We'll look at the way that the Ten Commandments have impacted the church in church history. How did the church think of the Ten Commandments? What is the place of the Ten Commandments? What did Jesus make of the Ten Commandments? I mean, if you think about the Sermon on the Mount, if somebody says, I'm not into Old Testament law, I simply follow the words of Jesus. Well, you realize Matthew 5-7, some of the most famous words of Jesus in all the Gospels. The Sermon on the Mount is simply a sermon on the Ten Commandments. So to say, I'm not into the words of the Old Testament, I'm just into the words of Jesus, misses the mark by a mile. The Sermon on the Mount is a sermon on the Ten Commandments. You have the true and greater Moses going up on the mountain. Just as Moses went on the mountain to deliver the law, Jesus goes up on the mountain as a true and greater Moses to deliver a sermon on the law. But I was reminded this week that I had assigned a bit of homework and then never got back to it. I had asked y'all to read a little bit from Herman Bavinck, and then I never brought it really up again in any detail. And then we've been gone for a couple of weeks. So there's that. So it's not my fault. We've been gone for a couple of weeks, not having Sunday school. But I wanted to turn back to this because it's simply so important. And I understand that some of this older theology can be difficult to read. They don't write in the same way that we're used to seeing things written today. But there is just so much here in what Bavinck said. Now, I told you last time we were together that the point of this sort of run-up to the Ten Commandments, and then from here on out in the book of Exodus, there are some very important questions being raised and answered for the people of God. One, how will they worship? What will their worship consist of? What will it look like? Two, will they keep the covenant? And what is given to them to help them keep the covenant and be covenantally faithful? And then three, what is the design of the tabernacle? What do I mean by that? Well, what's the decor like? What's the design physically? What's the structure look like? What's the decorations of the tabernacle supposed to be? What's the design of the tabernacle? But also, what is the real design or purpose? What is the spiritual design of the tabernacle? And as I've said many times, the whole Bible really is a tale of trees and temples, right? We've talked about this before. 3 trees: the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where we sinned; the tree of life that we were taken away from for protection; and the cursed tree upon which the second Adam died to pay for our sins at the first tree so we could be restored to the tree of life. And we see that in the book of Revelation. But it's not just a tale of trees, it's a tale of temples, because the garden was a temple. And now the tabernacle is a temple. And then by the time of the building of the temple, well, that's a temple. And then you have the second temple, and that's a temple. You have the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and yet Jesus has said His body's a temple. And we are temples of the Holy Spirit. And you get to the end of the Bible, the temple comes down, and the new heavens and new earth form a new and eternal temple. What's the point of the temple then, or the tabernacle? It can't be the materials it's made of. There were so many iterations of it. The point of the temple, or the design of the tabernacle, is intimacy with God, which is why we read in John 1:14 that the Word became flesh and pitched his tent. Eskenosin is the Greek word, tabernacled among us. That's why we call him Emmanuel. God is with us. That's the design of the temple or the tabernacle, ultimately, is that God would dwell with us in intimacy. The intimacy that we spurned in the garden temple, he's pursuing it and restoring it, and yet there are going to be things set around that relationship to God, such as his law, sacrifices, ceremonies, and in many ways that's what the rest of the book of Exodus is about. But we never really got to unpack the Bavinck reading. Now, some of you maybe were thinking, hey, David never said anything about the Bavinck reading. Maybe we don't have to read it. But you actually owe it to Debbie Pixley, who reminded me, hey, we didn't talk about the Bavinck reading. And all of you, I know there ain't nobody in here is under any idea that Debbie didn't do the Bavinck reading, right? She went home that Sunday and did it. But why Herman Bavinck? Herman Bavinck lived from 1854 to 1921. He was a contemporary of Abraham Kuyper, 1837 to 1920. He was a contemporary of B.B. Warfield, 1851 to 1921. So those guys all kind of were of the same age. He was a Dutch theologian. He was a Dutchman. And his theology is really probably, what he wrote, kind of a systematic theology called Guerre Reforme Dogmatique, is probably the best single set of systematic theology in the whole of Reformed theology. At Westminster, it is the text that we use in all of our systematics classes. When you come to Westminster, you got to get Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics day one, because you're going to be in those books every day for your whole 3 or 4 years. You're going to be there. That's how important he is. Now, he has a section here on holiness. And the impact of Bavinck is so evident in the history of the Reformed Church, both on that side of the Atlantic, this side of the Atlantic. He was actually very influential on a theologian named Louis Berkhoff. Now, maybe some of you have Berkhoff's single volume systematic theology. It's just kind of a distillation of Bavinck. But I remember David Cassidy. Some of y'all know David Cassidy. Used to be pastor over at Christ Community. He's now the pastor down in Florida. Maybe I've told you this story before, but when he was a young man, full of fire and full of passion, he had been raised Lutheran, but had since become a charismatic, and he was church planting, and he went over to London to do church planting in London. He was a young man in his 20s, and he just wanted to change the world for Christ. And while he was over there, he ended up going to L'Abri in England. They were going to have the opportunity to meet with none other than Francis Schaeffer. Now, this was near the end of Francis Schaeffer's life. And David and a handful of these young, fiery, church planter, charismatic kind of guys go to meet with Francis Schaeffer. Schaeffer comes out in hospital scrubs because at this point he is well into the progression of his cancer and is not going to be alive just a few more short months, but he agrees to meet with these young preachers. And while he's out there meeting with him at L'Abri, David tells a story. He said, Dr. Schaeffer, would you pray for revival in my generation? And Schaeffer said, no, young man, I will not. Yeah, right? No, young man, I will not. And David says, I asked him, why? Why would you say that? He said, young man, he said, tell me how you were raised. What denomination? He says, well, I was raised Lutheran. He said, and you had a confession of faith and you were catechized. And David said, yeah. And he said, but now you've kind of turned from all that and you're just going to set the streets on fire with your ministry. He said, young man, if I were to pray for revival and the Holy Spirit would fall on your generation of young men, it would be a tissue paper revival. It just burn up in a split second and be gone. He said, young man, you need to go stack up some dry wood. You need to go stack up some dry wood by studying theology. Then, if the Holy Spirit falls, the revival will burn and burn and burn. David's testimony is that he left L'Abri that very day, went into London, found a church near Hyde Park that had a bookstore attached to it, walked in. The man said, "How can I help you?" He said, "I just talked to a guy named Francis Schaeffer, and he said I need to read a theology book." The guy pulled down Louis Berkhoff from the shelf. David bought it, said he went to the park and started reading it that very day, and it changed everything. Why do I bring that story up? Because Louis Berkhoff was a student of Bavinck, but we're going to go back even further to the well himself. And I want to talk about holiness. Now, I'm going to reread just a small portion here of what you would have read, and then just see what thoughts, what questions you might have regarding holiness. Now, he goes on to say, I want to start at about the middle of that paragraph on page 2. At present, everyone acknowledges that the concept of holiness in the Old and New Testament expresses a relation of God to the world. There is disagreement, however, about the precise character of that relation, with a view to texts like Hosea 11:9, Isaiah 57:15, Ezekiel 29 and following. Mencken associated holiness with God's condescending goodness and grace. Baudissin, however, believed it was rather God's utter transcendence and power over all creatures that was expressed in holiness, and was supported in this view by Ritschl and others who appealed to the following texts. But then he goes on to say, and he goes on to kind of make a case for the stem kadosh, that's the stem for the word holiness, related to hadash, is usually translated by the root, and I'll skip all of the Hebrew here, but the point he's going to make is that the heart of holiness, or the idea of holiness, when we speak of the holiness of God, is that God is set apart. God is God, and we are not. God is God. There's an otherness to God expressed by the concept of holiness that strips away our ability to sort of reinvent him or recreate him in our own image. This, of course, is what confronted Isaiah in Isaiah 6:1-5, right? And had Isaiah, "I am undone. I am undone." Now, I'll say this, and then it's going to kind of open up for thoughts or questions. When's the last time that the thought of God, the concept of God himself, undid you a little bit, unraveled you a little bit? Or have you managed to live most of your life rather complacent, rather, dare I even say it, underwhelmed by the thought of God? And yet, what he's laying out here is that every time the holiness of God is mentioned, there is an utter unraveling. There's an unraveling in those who are in the presence of God. Have any of you ever met someone that you really, really have been longing to meet? Like you really have been all of that person, like a little child meeting their favorite football player. Is there anybody in here would say, "Yeah, I got to meet so-and-so, and it was the best day of my life"? Again, I'm sorry? No, nobody? Yeah, John.
Michael Card, after his concert a couple years ago, and I'd seen him at a few concerts and a few conferences, but after he sang here, he came to this piano and played songs that my children knew for them to sing along with him.
Oh, what a moment.
It was humble, it was beautiful, it was Jesus.
That had to be, wow. I bet. Now, were you like me? Did you get your phone out and video it, or did you just soak it in?
I got the videos, I'll send them to you.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's incredible. Years ago, like years and years ago, I'm thinking 1991 or 92, I went to my first Ligonier Ministries conference down in Orlando, Florida. It was the First Baptist Church. And that church is so large, their parking lot is so large that it is divided up by the fruit of the Spirit. No, I'm not kidding. If you park like in the bananas of grace or in the grapes of joy, I'm not kidding. There's symbols, and if you forget where you parked, where are the grapes? Because I know I parked in grapes, or I parked in the apples of patience, whatever. The church is massive, and that's where Ligonier for years would have its Ligonier conference. And so I'd been playing in a in a band here. I had hair down to my waist, but I'd gotten hold of R.C. Sproul, was reading everything I possibly could. And back in those days, there was no, downloading a podcast or any nonsense like that. Back in my day, if you want to, Emily Mayfield, you don't even understand what it was like. Back in my day, young lady, back in my day, if you wanted to listen to something, no podcast, you would order cassette tapes. I'd fill out a form for the R.C. Sproul tapes that I'd want. I'd put a check in the envelope, and 5 to 6 short weeks later, those cassette tapes would show up, and I would listen to them. Anyway, we go down to the Ligonier conference. I want to see R.C. Sproul. I've been listening to countless tapes by R.C., and so I sit on the front row. The conference begins, and the MC comes out. Hey, everybody, good to see everybody. Where's everybody from? Blah, 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 blah. So good. Like 2,000, 2,500 people there. And he said, I'm curious, what kind of person would come to a conference and sit right on the front row? Young man, he said, would you stand up and come and let's introduce you? And so I stood up, and the whole audience, 2,500 people, just gasped in horror because they're all there in the PCA uniform. You know, when you become a member of a PCA church, you get a navy blazer and a pair of khaki slacks. That's just like, for most men, if you become a member, suddenly your clothing just transforms, right? Into a navy, blazer and a pair of khaki pants. And so they're all over the place, and they just gasp because I have hair down to my waist. I'm playing in a rock band. And he says, young man, where are you from? I said, Nashville, Tennessee. And he said, what brings you here? I said, well, I just love the teaching of R.C. and blah, blah, blah. And he said, have you ever met R.C. Sproul? I said, no. He said, R.C., come on out. And R.C. walks out a side door, walks out, walks down to the front of the stage. He puts his arm around me, and I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it. R.C., he talking like this, and smoking cigarettes his whole life. And anyway, he looked at me and he says, young man, I'm going to have my eye on you. And I thought to myself, yeah, I think that might be more than just while I'm on the front row. I think I have an obligation to the Reformed faith. I think I have an obligation to the word that was going to be unpacked that day by the likes of Sproul and J.I. Packer and so forth, other speakers who were there. But I'll never forget him saying that to me. And I'll never forget meeting him that day. There have been others in my life, and probably the same for you. I remember years ago we were at Pancake Pantry, and Vince Gill was sitting there. We were there with Diane's parents, and she just made the comment, well, there's Vince Gill. And Diane's mom didn't know who Vince Gill was. Now, y'all know who Vince Gill is. But she leaned over the table, she says, does Pat Boone ever come here? Does Pat Boone ever come here? Have you ever been in the presence of someone that you're just like, I'm not going to forget this? What is it like to be in the presence of a God who is thrice holy, who is kadosh, who is other than, set apart? So let me ask you, enough of my rattling. What are some things that you thought or underlined or questions that you have about the holiness of God from what you've read here in Bavinck? Who'll be first?
So David, when I think of being set apart, it's remarkable because set apart from something, right? It begs an object. The subject begs an object. Other than, right? God is holy,
Yeah.
God is holy, God is other than his creation, right? So even this word, this concept that tells us of God's majesty, his infinite nature in every way, still seems like humble condescension because he is nonetheless defining himself by his relation to us.
So he is defining himself by his relation to us covenantally, okay? In and of himself, he is utterly other than we are. So it is condescension. Creation is condescension. His grace toward us is condescension. So that's the remarkable thing about the grace of God is this utterly holy God who is, as the old hymn says, ineffable. You can't even speak adequately, right? and yet he condescends to the likes of us. He condescends immediately, right? He didn't even take any time to kind of cool off. He condescends immediately when Adam and Eve spurn him in the garden. So it's hard for us to conceive, we really can't conceive of his holiness apart from his relationship to us, which is why his holiness immediately leads us to a contemplation of his grace or his condescension toward us. Yeah. Yeah. Could somebody pass this mic? It's 1, 2, 1, 2. Let me get a little more juice going here. Hang on here. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Check, check, check. Here we go.
No, you can't.
I'm trying to work through how God's holiness would be immutable then.
How it would be.
Immutable, like, in that if he was set apart, like his holiness is behind of being set apart, at the very beginning, what is he being set apart? Because you talk about him being set apart from his creation.
Uh-huh.
How does his holiness reveal itself as an immutable characteristic of God?
Okay. Because he relates to us. So how can his holiness be immutable? Okay. So good points. Good question. So how can God, not just in his holiness, be immutable, how can he be immutable and relate to creation? Because there was a time when creation was not. There was a time when creation was not. And now that he's relating to something that theretofore was not, but now is, does that involve a change in him? So theologians speak of the Trinity ad intra and the Trinity ad extra. Now those are Latin phrases that essentially mean God ad intra, as he is essentially or in and of himself, does not change. Because if God changes for the better, that presupposes a time when he was worse. If he changes for the worse, that presupposes a time when he was better. And he can't be God. So God does not change ad intra, in and of himself. And yet, when he creates outside of himself, that does not involve a change within himself. It involves a change outside of himself that is not him. So creation is not God. The created order, time, and everything that goes with it is not God. God brings that about and relates to what he's created, but that does not involve any essence change in him. There is no essential change in him. Now, you may just go ahead and jump to the most obvious place. I mean, we're going to the deep end of the pool already. You may then say, okay, well, then how do we understand the incarnation? Have some of you started thinking about Christmas already? Anybody in here? Allowing yourself? Yeah, I see it. September is when the Christmas music starts in my world, okay? September is when the Christmas music starts. How is it that God could become man and that not involve a change to God, essentially? And it's because what you have in the incarnation, for instance, is the eternal second member of the Godhead, the Logos, the eternal Son of God, assumes, as our confession says, a rational soul and a human body. But there is no commingling or confusion or change in the eternal divine second member of the Godhead. There is a joining, but not a commingling. A commingling would involve a change. A confusion would involve a change. There is a joining, but not a commingling, such that the human nature and the divine nature are not divorceable, but are distinguishable. They don't meld into one new nature.
Sinless.
And yeah, and he's sinless. And that accounts for the sinlessness of Christ. Yeah, and there's no intermingling of the human nature. But how is it that the human Christ remains sinless? Is because of the divinity of Christ, which is another topic to discuss. But God is able to relate to his creation without becoming in any way his creation. Does that make sense? So God can relate to his creation without becoming his creation, or without his creation effecting some kind of essential change in him, which is why we insist on the creator-creature distinction. So God remains utterly holy, and yet he condescends to us. Now, he condescends to us as an act of grace. Creation itself is a condescending act on God's part, because God is so high above and other than we are. And that's this idea of him being set apart. Now, this is going to have implications for how we view ourselves and what it means that we are called more than anything else in the New Testament. We are called the holy ones, or as I like to say, the holified ones. And we can get there in a second. But other questions here? And if anything I say is not clear, just say, David, go at that again and clear it up for me.
So what is God set apart from when there is nothing else to be set apart from? In the eternal state before creation, what is he set apart from? There's nothing else.
So what is God set apart from if before creation there is nothing else? God is set apart from anything that is not him. So prior to creation, prior to the created realm around us, God existed, and he is his own existence. It's a really great question. In fact, that's such a good question. Got a little, all right, see if I can do this. Everybody's getting a little nervous right now. Everybody's saying, David, please underhand it. Don't.
Give him two.
So Jim says, I got to give you two. I got to give you two. Hey, this one's to share. This one's to share. All right, take that one. And who are you going to give that to? There you go, Ian. Enjoy that. Somebody else is going to get one of these. Does anybody in here play a keytar? You know what a keytar is? I should have taken a picture of you playing that keytar the other day. That was so awesome. It was like something out of the 80s. Now, back to the great question here. Prior to creation, there were no sinners that God had to be set apart from. There was no devil that God had to be set apart from. There was no fallen angels that God did. There was no sin that God had to be set apart from. There wasn't a David Filson that God said, hey, David, I am holy and I am high and above you. I am set apart. So God in his eternal existence, what could he possibly have been set apart from? Non-existence, which is at the end of the day our greatest fear. God in his eternal existence is the utter antithesis to nothingness, which is why atheism is utterly impossible. Which is why the suggestion that something came from nothing is utterly an absurdity. Because what is nothing? Nothing is not a thing. Nothing has no metaphysical, ontological reality to it. And so God, before the creation of the likes of you and me, in his eternal, perfect, immutable, unchangeable existence, he is the utter antithesis of non-being, which is why God says to Moses in Exodus 3, whom shall I say send me? And God says, tell them I am Yahweh. What does that word mean? God is covenant Lord. Well, if you lift the hood up on covenant Lord, it means that God is pure, independent existence. And as pure, independent existence, he is perfect and he is eternal. Because there's not the very possibility of non-existence. Non-existence is an utter absurdity. And so God is set apart from absurdity. He is set apart from illogic. He is set apart from non-existence. Which is why he can bring into existence things that were not and now are. Does that make sense? He's set apart from non-existence. When we start thinking about God this way, suddenly our tendency to recreate him in our own image, kind of the big guy upstairs, kind of patronizing nonsense. We're like, no, whoa, wait. God is his attributes and he is pure, independent being. And because he is that, even before creation of the world, the phenomenological world, you, me, the angels in heaven, both the elect and the fallen, before any of that, he is set apart from non-being. His very eternal existence means that non-being is not a possibility. So that when someone might say, I believe that there was something and then there was nothing and then suddenly there was something, or that something came out of nothing, it actually makes no sense logically. Atheism. So the eternal existence of God is, you simply can't get around it. You can't get around it, because to conceive of nothing, the minute you think you've conceived of nothing, you've actually conceived of something. Like if I say, close your eyes and think of nothing. And you go, I've got it, David, I've got it. I'm conceiving of nothing. Well, what you're actually conceiving of is quite something. So God's eternal existence, his very being, means that nothingness has never been and can never be. Yeah, Jim?
What about the problem of evil? Where does it come from?
The problem of evil, so if we ask where does evil come from, we would say this. Augustine, 354 to 430, said that evil is the privation of the good or the absence of the good. That doesn't mean that evil is like non-existent. It's just, the way we describe not being happy about a lack of good. Evil is a reality. Evil is a reality. So the question then becomes a moral one. If God is eternally existent and he is in charge of everything, how do we account or how do we place the problem of evil? Now, this is something that always comes up in questions of apologetics and debate and so forth. And, Christopher Hitchens, who tragically died December 15, 2011, would always bring this up in his debates. It is always his trump card at the very end. He'd pull that card out of his sleeve and lay it down. Christianity can't get around the problem of evil, i.e. the existence of evil is an internal logical self-destruct mechanism for the Christian worldview. Well, when it comes to placing the problem of evil, the existence of evil, the reality of evil is not an internal self-destruct mechanism for the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview can account for evil as evil. It's actually the atheistic materialist worldview that cannot account for evil as evil. So if evil is a logical internal self-destruct mechanism, it is for the atheistic worldview. What do I mean by that? Well, long before Christopher Hitchens would bring this up in debates over the last 2 or 3 decades, you can go back 250 years before Jesus Christ. Epicurus was a philosopher. He was a Greek philosopher who said, the Christian doctrine or the biblical doctrine is that God is all good, omnibenevolent. God is all powerful, omnipotent. Evil exists. And since evil exists, God is either not all powerful or not all good. Because maybe he's all powerful and could do something about it, but doesn't, then don't call him good. Or maybe he is good and would do something about it if he could, but he can't be all powerful. In either case, he's not God. And so that's been brought up as sort of the unraveling of the doctrine of God is the problem of evil. And of course, this is repeated, down throughout the ages. In the 1700s, you have David Hume doing this. In 1976, you had George Smith in his book, The Case Against God, do this. Christopher Hitchens is doing it. Every internet influencer atheist brings up the problem of evil as though it is an internal, in other words, it presents a logical problem for the Christian worldview. Well, here's the thing. The Christian worldview is not God is omnibenevolent, all good, all loving. God is omnipotent, all powerful. Evil exists. That's not the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview is God is omnibenevolent, all loving, omnipotent, all powerful. Evil exists. And there's a fourth premise. God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil he allows. Now, if I say,
So you're saying God allows it, so can you stretch say he created it, he allows it? Where does it come from?
yeah, God is not, so our own confession, Westminster Confession of Faith and Doctrine of Predestination says that God sovereignly foreordains whatsoever comes to pass, yet so thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is the contingency of secondary causation taken away, but rather established. So God ordains evil, but does not fabricate the evil. He's not the maker of evil. He ordains the evil. So God is able to ordain positively regeneration in the heart. But God also ordains by withholding his restraining grace. So God can fabricate things, new birth in your heart, but he does not fabricate or make evil. And yet, just because he doesn't make evil doesn't mean that he doesn't ordain evil. For instance, if we say, well, if God didn't create the evil, then he couldn't have ordained it as such, then we can't explain the cross. Or we can't explain the most evil thing that's ever happened, namely the cross of Christ. He ordained the cross, and yet, as Peter preaches, this was done because of evil men. So, the question of the Christian worldview, God is all powerful, all loving, evil exists, but God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil that he allows. If I say, no, I'm not buying that, God cannot have a morally sufficient reason for the evil he allows. Stephen Fry, the British humorist and author, Stephen Fry, maybe you've seen him, pretty well-known guy, was once asked on some British talk show, and he's an atheist, Stephen Fry, and he was asked, if you die and you discover after you die that there's a heaven and a hell and a God, what are you going to say to God if you discover that you were wrong and God actually exists? And Stephen Fry didn't miss a beat. He said, I would look at God and I would say, cancer in children? How dare you? So what is Stephen Fry doing there? Evil exists. As an atheist, I don't believe in God. And it's the existence of evil that makes God non-existent, makes God not possible to be believed in. Because if there was a God, there would be no evil. But of course, the problem, though, is not logical for the Christian worldview. It's actually a problem for the atheistic worldview. Because if I'm a materialist and I believe that all that exists is matter in motion, everything is simply material, everything is matter, and all you and I are just accidentally evolved bags of biology. What is actually evil? What is actual evil? Well, the minute I speak of evil as evil, for the actual evil that it is, the only way I can account for evil as if there is the opposite transcendent good. Unless I want to say, no, the opposite of the evil is just my opinion, whatever I like or don't like. Well, most atheists aren't going to fall for that. And so what they are assuming when they call out evil as evil and then blame God or say God doesn't exist and the Christian worldview is flawed because evil exists, they're actually assuming the only worldview that can account for evil as evil, namely the Christian worldview. Because by virtue of the transcendent God of the law and the law of the transcendent God, we actually don't have a logical problem with evil. We don't love evil, we lament evil, but it's not a logical self-destruct mechanism for our worldview. Because we can say God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil he allows. If I say, no, I don't believe in that God, and your notion that God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil he allows, he can't possibly have a morally sufficient reason for the evil he allows, then I've got a problem as an atheist. Because I am assuming or positing a higher judicatory of morality than God, to which God is failing to measure up. And yet, as a materialist atheist, there's nothing transcendent. And so what's the higher adjudicatory that God is failing to measure up to? My opinion. My opinion. I've not denied that there's a God. I've just declared that I'm him. But at the end of the day, all the atheists can do, as you know, is to stand at the gates of Auschwitz and say, I don't like what happened in there, or what happened in there frightens me. But the last thing an actual consistent atheist can do is say that was wrong. Because if we are simply in a materialist universe, let me ask you, when's the last time you've held a handful of wrong? Or held a handful of right? Or held a handful of logic? Those things aren't material. And yet in my world, all that exists is matter. And then if I say, as an atheist, if I say, no, wait a second, David, wait a second, those things do exist. In my mind, I know what logic is and I know what right and wrong is. And I can say, yeah, you do, but that's because you're creating the image of God. But according to your worldview, all your mind is just a way that you're describing your material brain. And what you call mind is just chemicals, material chemicals and material neurons firing. And if that's the case, how do we get oughtness? How do we get oughtness from mere impersonal matter? If all that exists is matter, and all you have in your head is a brain, and I have a brain, which you might want to dispute that, but where is the universal obligatory reality that exists between my brain and yours that would say we both should agree that 2 + 2 = 4, or we both should agree that stealing is wrong? We're just material brains with neurons and chemicals sloshing around. There is no material reality to evil or to logic. And so for me to say something should or ought to be, or should or ought not to be, only way I can say that if I'm an atheist and really mean it is because I'm actually creating the image of God, and according to Romans 2:15, the law of God's written on my heart. And I know what holiness is because I'm creating the image of the holy God. But Romans 1:18-32 says, I'm trying to deny it, suppress it, and run from it. But you can't suppress what you don't have. So how is it that those who deny the existence of God suppress God's existence, the truth of God's existence? You can't suppress what you don't have. They suppress what they have because they're created in the image of God, and that's why they know. I mean, think about this. If we're created in the image of God, That's why we know there is evil in this world. But the Christian worldview does not have a logical problem with evil. We have a problem with it, but we have a solution, and that solution is Jesus Christ. But there's not a logical inconsistency with the Christian worldview. God has a morally sufficient reason for the evil he allows. If I deny that, I'm suggesting that there's a higher judicatory of morality than God, to which God is failing to measure up. I can assert that all day long, but I can't account for it. You see the difference? I can say there's a higher standard of morality than God, and God's failing to meet it. I can assert that all day long. I can shout it from the rooftops. I can assert it, but when you ask me to account for it, I can't. I can just assert it. And asserting and accounting are two very different things. Does that help? All right, other thoughts or questions? Debbie, what do you have here? What do you have for us?
So if you go back into Genesis, there's only one time that the word holy in Greek or in Hebrew or in English is used. And in Genesis 2:3, it said, on the seventh day God rested,
Yeah.
and he blessed the Sabbath and made it holy.
Yep.
So I have two questions. The first one is, on when God rested on the Sabbath, and it says he made it holy, that's prior to the fall of sin. And so is there a difference between saying God set it apart, right? So the Sabbath is God setting the seventh day apart for a different purpose.
Yeah.
Is the Bible saying that it's holy?
You see that? Just kept talking, just grabbed it. Debbie got hands, man. Debbie got hands.
The ice hockey goalie skill came in.
The what? The ice hockey.
Yeah, you didn't know I played bowling? I was an ice hockey goalie.
You never cease to amaze me. Now, nobody cares about your question. They just want to know about you playing hockey.
So is there a reason why the English ESV and others translate it as God making the Sabbath holy rather than saying he set it apart?
Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, so let me address that one. They say that he made it holy because that's actually what the word Kadesh means, because to be holy means to be set apart. Now, in this case, this is before the fall. This is pre-lapsarian. This is before the fall. So what kind of sin is there in the universe for the Sabbath to be different from? Well, a couple of things. One, the Sabbath is set apart from the other days of the week, which have purpose for work. You'll do your labor in 6 days, and the seventh is set apart unto the Lord. So the set apartness of the Sabbath is not that it's being set apart from, well, the other days of the week are sinful. The other days of the week are evil, but the Sabbath day is good and holy. No, it's set apart unto something. The Sabbath is to be set apart unto the Lord. Now, in this created, in the garden, there was not sin, and yet sin had already entered the created realm, namely with the fall of Lucifer and a third of the angels with him. But the set apartness of the Sabbath is that it is set apart unto something, and that's why it is holy. It is holy for the Lord. Now, we could do sinful things with the Sabbath, and we do sinful things with the Sabbath. But it's not that the other days of the week are sinful and the Sabbath is not going to be. It's that the other days of the week are for these God-directed purposes of doing our work, which was to be done unto the Lord. But there was a difference between the Sabbath and the rest of the days, and it was this. God rested on the Sabbath, not because he was tired and just needed a break, but the rest that God takes is an analogy or a model for the rest we're to take, which is not just, hey, Sunday's the day that I catch up on my sleep. I mean, it may be part of what you do on the Lord's Day, but the rest involved is a resting in the Lord. And in that sense, it is the Sabbath day is holy to the Lord. It is set apart for the Lord, to the Lord, not set apart from Monday through Saturday, which are sinful in that sense, but set apart in that this day is to be dedicated to the Lord, consecrated to the Lord, in a way that Monday through Saturday are not. Does that make sense? Yeah. What's your second question?
So the second question is, again, following this theme that the word holy is not used throughout the entirety of Genesis. So keeping in mind that Moses wrote the whole Pentateuch. The next time that holy comes up is when Moses is at the burning bush and God says, take off your sandals because you're standing on holy ground. And so it struck me as kind of two things. One, that there was no mention of holy throughout anything that happened in Genesis, whether it's with Abraham or Jacob or Isaac or Joseph. And then the second is, when Moses suddenly hears that he's standing on holy ground, how would he have understood what that meant? Or is it, because suddenly from that point on, the rest of Exodus and most of Leviticus and part of Numbers, holiness is a key point of everything, and God explaining how to consecrate and set apart and what it means to be holy.
Excellent, penetrating questions here. So let me work through them backwards. The reason that Moses would have understood in Exodus 3 what God meant when he said, I'm holy, I'm other, is because by the time Moses actually puts pen to paper and writes Exodus, he's already lived out the experience of God's holiness for all this time, experiencing the holiness of God, seeing the holiness of God, learning about it. And so when he writes about it, he knows what he's writing about. Because remember, these events in the book of Exodus are written about in retrospect. He's reflecting back on what's happened and writing about those things. I think it is by design of the Holy Spirit that holiness does not become a thing, as it were, in terms of a revelation until Exodus chapter 3, because that's actually the point of Exodus, is the utter holiness of God. It's not that God wasn't holy when the events of Genesis were occurring. Of course he was. I mean, that's why Adam and Eve were taken out of the garden. That's why Genesis 6-9, Noah and the ark. That is why Genesis 11, the confusion of the languages, because they were trying to get to heaven on the holiness of their own accord rather than God's. So holiness is all throughout the book of Genesis, but it's not mentioned because holiness as a construct, or holiness as a term that's going to become central, really is what the book of Exodus is about. Everything in Exodus is about the holiness of God. And the rest of the Pentateuch, you could say in many ways, is about that. Leviticus, in terms of the laws that are laid out, Deuteronomy, the same thing. But it's really living those laws out and experiencing those things in the narrative, the story of Exodus, that God as holy becomes the feature, or that becomes the emphasis, I guess would be the better word. Now, in the book of Genesis, again, it's not that God isn't holy, but there is, as Moses is recording these things and writing these things out, he's giving the story of the patriarchs in Genesis, and they are experiencing the holiness of God. And yet, what is the question of Exodus 3? Who is this God that we have to deal with? Who is this God that is picking up where Genesis leaves off and is taking his people into the wilderness? Who is sending me? Right? Moses asks, who is sending me? And that's when God reveals his utter otherness, his utter ineffable otherness is the only way I can think of to describe it. So I think it's a theological and literary intentionality on the part of the Holy Spirit that the holiness of God takes center stage essentially at the beginning of Exodus in a way that you didn't see it in Genesis.
Two pieces of candy. She got two questions.
I got two questions there. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, Debbie? You've written about these things. What are your thoughts?
Hold on.
Just when I...
That was the paper's fault.
That was, yeah, I know. That was not good.
So the other one that I had asked you about was in Jeremiah, the first couple of verses of Jeremiah. And essentially, God says, before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you.
Yeah.
Before you were born, I consecrated you, which is also, so consecrated is the same word, right? So
Yep.
to be set apart, to be consecrated, to be sanctified, to be holy is all the same word.
Yep.
And so that concept of what did it mean for Jeremiah to be consecrated or set apart?
So in Jeremiah's case, in Jeremiah 1:1-9, Jeremiah is replying because he doesn't want to go, and who can blame him? I mean, Judah, the language of Jeremiah is that Judah is like clay that is already dried up and past reshaping. Judah's heart is hardened. Jeremiah wants nothing to do with it. And so Jeremiah replies to Yahweh and says, look, I'm too young. Go find somebody more mature. And God says to Jeremiah, do not say I am but a youth. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and I kadosh, I set apart, I consecrated you, I appointed you, depending on your translation. But really what it means is I holied you. I holied you. I holified you. I set you apart. I set him apart in that context to be a prophet. So remember, the ultimate base level meaning of holiness or holy is set apart. Now, the reason that we immediately think of holiness as a moral category is because the set-apartedness, if I can say it that way, in God Himself and in His plans for us is that His people would be set apart from non-existence, set apart from death, set apart from the fall and the guilt and shame and condemnation of the fall. And so ultimately, God holifying us or declaring us holy, or even saying to Jeremiah, I have consecrated you and set you apart for this purpose, to be a prophet, just as I set apart or consecrated the Sabbath for a particular purpose, rest, I've set you apart for a purpose to be a prophet, but a prophet unto what? A prophet to know God. The purpose of the Sabbath is to know God. To know God, and in knowing God, to be rescued from the fall and from shame and guilt and condemnation and death itself. Jeremiah is consecrated or holified to be a prophet. Toward what end? That he would preach or declare this God who alone can rescue us from the fall and from death and shame and condemnation and so forth. So yes, there's a moral facet to holiness, but the baseline facet of holiness, both ours and God's, is that we are consecrated apart from all that is not God or godly or God's purposes. Which takes us to the idea of the most common way that you and I are described in the New Testament is we're called saints. Saints. The Greek word there is the hagios. That's the plural of hagios, which is the noun, the nominal form of the verb hagiadzo. Hagiadzo, I sanctify, or I set apart, or I consecrate. The number one way that you and I are described by the New Testament is that we are the set apart ones. We are the holified ones. You have been set apart. And you say, well, David, you said we're to be set apart for a purpose. Actually, you're set apart for a person. You are set apart for the person of the triune God. You are set apart for the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Which is why we say, I am not my own. What is your only comfort in life and death? And the first line of the Heidelberg Catechism, what is your only comfort in life and death? That I am not my own, but belong unto my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. Just stop there. If I believed that, if you believed that, how much stress and anxiety would wash away? The reason that we struggle so with sin and temptation and anxiety and worry is because I believe I am my own and I don't have a belonging. And it scares me. And so I give myself over to worry and anxiety. But if I believe that I'm consecrated under the Lord, I mean, what the Heidelberg Catechism is saying, what's your only comfort in life and death? I'm holy. That's what you're saying. If you say, well, David, hang out with me for 5 minutes, you realize I'm not very holy. Look, we all have a ways to go in sanctification. Calvin says we creep along the ground slowly. But at the end of the day, our only comfort, our main comfort in life and death is that we are consecrated to a person. Yeah, Steve?
Back to Jim's question, where does sin originate? Did it originate with Lucifer becoming jealous of God?
Yeah, that would be the origin of sin in the created universe. Is not Adam and Eve. Prior to Adam and Eve, sin existed. It's not that Adam and Eve created sin. Sin existed prior to Adam and Eve. I mean, that's why the serpent, it was a sinful serpent who slithered into the garden to begin with. And so while the Bible doesn't give us the blueprint for this or explain everything that we might find curious about the origin of evil, it does originate with the fall of Lucifer and a third of the angels with him. Yeah.